On Father's Day, my daughter slapped me in the face and called me Mom's ex-husband and her new stepfather her real dad. Her betrayal tore apart 33 years of love, but one sentence from me made her cry and beg for forgiveness. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are now. The knife stopped mid-slice when I heard her tone. I'd been chopping carrots for my evening soup, the rhythmic thunking against the cutting board filling the quiet kitchen. Steam rose from the pot behind me, carrying the scent of chicken broth and thyme. Then the phone rang, cutting through my small domestic symphony like a blade. Agnes. My shoulders lifted instinctively. Maybe she was calling to chat, to ask about my day the way she used to, the way daughters should. Hi, Dad. Her voice carried that particular flatness I'd grown to dread. Look, I can come to this Father's Day thing of yours, but not for long. I set the knife down carefully, wiping my hands on the dish towel hanging from my belt loop. The steam from my soup suddenly felt suffocating. Of course, Agnes, I'd be happy to see you. I forced brightness into my voice the way I'd learned to do. Even if it's just for a little while? Right. Well, I'll probably drive over around noon on Sunday, but I can't stay past 3. I promised Mom and Eldon I'd help them with their garden party. Their garden party? Not our Father's Day. I stirred the soup with my free hand, watching the vegetables swirl in lazy circles. The wooden spoon felt heavier than it should. That sounds lovely, I managed. I was thinking of making that roast you used to love. Remember? The one with the herb crust? Just don't cook that turkey from the 80s, okay? That thing was dry as cardboard. She laughed, but it held no warmth. I'd never cooked turkey for Father's Day, not once. But correcting her would only make things worse. Of course not. I'll make something special. I turned down the heat under my pot, buying myself time to think. Maybe we could look through some old photos while you're here? I found those albums from when you were little. Dad, I really can't stay long. 3 hours max, and that's pushing it. 3 hours. After a year of missed calls and brief text messages, 3 hours was what I got. I leaned against the counter, suddenly aware of how empty my kitchen felt. One bowl waiting by the stove. One spoon. One everything. 3 hours sounds perfect, I lied. We'll make the most of it. Good. And Dad, maybe try to, I don't know, keep things light. I don't want to spend the whole time talking about your problems or whatever. My problems. As if missing my daughter was just another item on a list of complaints. I closed my eyes, counted to 3 the way my therapist had taught me. Absolutely. Just a nice, relaxing afternoon. Great. Okay, I need to go. Eldon's calling me for dinner. Eldon's calling. At 7:30 on a Thursday, she was having dinner with my ex-wife and her new husband, the man who'd somehow replaced me in every way that mattered. Give my regards to your mother, I said, though the words tasted bitter. Will do. See you Sunday, Dad. The line went dead before I could say goodbye. I stood there holding the phone, listening to the dial tone mix with the gentle bubbling from my stove. The carrots on my cutting board had begun to dry out at the edges, half-chopped, abandoned, just like everything else in my life seemed to be. The soup needed tending. I had dishes to wash, bills to sort, a dozen small tasks that filled my evenings. But for a long moment, I couldn't move. Just held that silent phone and stared at my reflection in the dark kitchen window. 3 hours. After everything we'd been, everything we'd shared, I got 3 hours. I finally set the phone down and turned back to my cutting board. The knife felt foreign in my grip now, heavier. But I kept chopping, measuring each slice with the precision I'd learned in 40 years of engineering. Some habits die hard, even when everything else falls apart. The soup would be ready in 20 minutes. I'd eat it alone, like always, while planning what to cook for a daughter who couldn't wait to leave. I abandoned the soup. The vegetables could overcook for all I cared. Agnes's voice still echoed in my kitchen, that casual dismissal cutting deeper than any outright rejection could have. I found myself walking to the living room, drawn by something I couldn't name. The photo albums sat on the bottom shelf of my bookcase, exactly where I'd left them after my last bout of masochistic nostalgia. My fingers traced the leather spine of the oldest one before pulling it free. Dust motes danced in the lamplight as I settled into my chair. 5 years ago, everything changed. Lost my job, then lost my family. The words rolled through my mind with practiced familiarity. I'd repeated them to therapists, to myself, to the empty walls of this house until they'd worn smooth as river stones. But tonight they felt sharp again, newly painful. I opened the album to a photo from 2019, our last real Christmas together. Lula wore the red sweater I'd bought her. Agnes had her arm around my shoulder, and we all looked genuinely happy. Before Eldon, before the engineering firm downsized me out of existence, before everything unraveled like a cheap sweater. The divorce papers were in the next room, filed away in my desk drawer, with all the other documents that marked the end of my old life. I could picture them without looking. Yellow legal paper, coffee stains from that terrible morning in the lawyer's office. My signature still bold and confident, even as my world crumbled. 60 years old when they let me go. Too old to start over, too young to retire. The severance lasted 8 months. 8 months of sending out resumes that disappeared into digital voids while I watched Lula's patience evaporate like morning dew. She'd started working late, book club meetings that ran past midnight, long phone calls she took in the other room, her voice taking on a tone I'd never heard before. Lighter, younger. When she finally told me about Eldon, I wasn't surprised, just empty. He makes me feel like myself again, she'd said, as if 32 years of marriage had erased her identity instead of building it. He sees potential in me. Unlike me, apparently, the man who'd worked double shifts to put her through graduate school, who'd celebrated every small victory, every promotion, every moment she'd shown. But potential was a luxury we couldn't afford after my job disappeared. I flipped through more photos. Agnes at 10, missing her front teeth, grinning beside the treehouse I'd built her. Agnes at 16, rolling her eyes at my dad jokes but still laughing despite herself. Agnes at 25, calling me for advice about her first real job, her voice bright with trust. When had that trust begun to fracture? It started slowly, like rust eating through metal. Phone calls grew shorter. Visits became obligations instead of choices. She stopped asking my opinion and started quoting Eldon's wisdom instead, the successful businessman who'd stepped in to fill the void my unemployment had created. The coffee maker gurgled in the kitchen, a sound I'd programmed to comfort my evening routine. I'd made coffee mechanically while my marriage dissolved, while Agnes gradually shifted her loyalty to a man who could provide what I couldn't: stability, confidence, a future without question marks. I pulled out another album, this one from Agnes's college years. Her graduation photos showed her beaming beside both her parents, my arm around her waist, Lula holding her other hand. We'd looked like a team then, a family unit, unbreakable. 2 years later, Lula remarried. 6 months after that, Agnes started calling Eldon her bonus dad. The phrase made my stomach turn every time I heard it, as if fathers were interchangeable parts you could swap out when the original broke down. The legal documents felt heavy when I finally retrieved them from my desk. Custody arrangements for an adult daughter, as if love could be scheduled like a business meeting. Property division that left me with half of nothing. Alimony calculations that assumed I'd find another job paying what I used to make. I never did. The house settled around me with small creaks and sighs, a 60-year-old man's symphony of solitude. I spread the photographs across my coffee table like tarot cards, trying to read the future in faces that had once looked at me with unqualified love. One photo made me pause. Agnes at 7, chocolate ice cream smeared across her cheek, her small hand gripping mine as we walked through the zoo. I'd been her hero then, her protector, her first and most important love. Now I was the obligation she squeezed in before more important engagements, the fated father she tolerated out of duty rather than desire. I gathered up most of the photos, filing them back into their albums with careful precision, but I kept that zoo picture, holding it up to the light. Agnes's gap-toothed grin looked back at me, trusting and pure and completely mine. 3 hours on Sunday. I'd take what I could get. The zoo picture trembled in my hands as I settled deeper into my chair. Agnes couldn't have been more than 7 in this shot. Chocolate ice cream smeared across her cheek like war paint. Her tiny fingers gripped mine with absolute trust, while we stood before the elephant enclosure. I remembered that day perfectly, how she'd gasped when the baby elephant trumpeted, how she'd insisted on riding my shoulders for the entire walk back to the car. "You're my superhero, Daddy," she declared that afternoon, her arms wrapped around my neck as I carried her through the parking lot. "You're the strongest man in the whole world. The strongest man." I almost laughed at the bitter irony. By the time she turned 12, she was defending me to classmates who mocked my ancient Honda. "My dad's car is vintage," she'd announce with fierce pride, chin jutted out like a tiny warrior. "It's got character." She'd inherited my stubborn streak, that refusal to back down when something mattered. High school brought different challenges, but she still came to me first. Boy troubles, college applications, career dreams. I was her sounding board, her trusted advisor. Even when Lula dismissed her ambitions as unrealistic, Agnes would find me in my workshop, perch on my tool bench, and lay out her hopes like blueprints. "You always believe in me, Dad," she'd said during one of those late-night conversations, even when I don't believe in myself. I set down the photo and walked through the house, touching objects connected to those memories. The kitchen table where she'd done homework while I cooked dinner. The living room corner where she'd practiced violin, torturing our ears with squeaky scales until the music finally emerged, pure and sweet. In my bedroom closet, I found the shoebox full of Father's Day cards she'd made me over the years, construction paper hearts in primary colors, childish handwriting that declared me the best dad ever in crayon block letters. Each one was signed with elaborate flourishes, as if her 7-year-old signature carried the weight of a royal decree. She used to call me her hero. What happened to that little girl? The answer lurked in my more recent memories, the ones I tried not to examine too closely. Agnes at 28, comparing my advice unfavorably to something Eldon had said. Agnes at 30, asking me to contribute to her down payment, but mentioning that Eldon had already covered most of it. Agnes at 32, the first time she'd referred to him as more like a real father. That phrase had hit me like a physical blow. I'd raised her from age 2, when Lula and I adopted her from the foster system, taught her to ride a bike, attended every school play, stayed up nights when she had fever or nightmares or teenage heartbreak. But somehow, in 3 short years, a man who'd bought his way into our lives had become more real than the father who'd loved her unconditionally for 3 decades. The kitchen timer chimed from the other room, my abandoned soup, probably ruined by now. But I couldn't bring myself to care. I was lost in the systematic destruction of everything I'd thought permanent. Eldon had resources I'd never possessed. Money for elaborate vacations, connections for career advancement, the kind of social confidence that came from never doubting your place in the world. When Agnes graduated with her MBA, he'd thrown her a party at his country club. When she got promoted, he'd taken her to celebrate at restaurants I couldn't pronounce, let alone afford. I'd offered what I could, homemade dinners, long walks, the kind of steady presence that doesn't photograph well for social media. But steady presence couldn't compete with wine tours in Tuscany or networking events with industry leaders. The change accelerated after my job loss. Agnes's phone calls became shorter, her visits more perfunctory. She'd arrive for obligatory holiday dinners and spend the time texting, fielding calls from her bonus family about more exciting plans. I became the warm-up act before the main event. Now I was planning Sunday's menu with the desperate precision of a man running out of chances. Her old favorites, garlic mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, the chocolate chip cookies she used to help me bake. Maybe familiar tastes would trigger familiar feelings, remind her of who we used to be together. I'd pulled out the good china, the set Lula had left behind, set 2 places at the dining room table like an optimist or a fool. I wasn't sure which. 3 hours. In 3 hours, I'd try to compress 33 years of fatherhood into something Agnes might actually remember fondly. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 10:30. I should go to bed, get some sleep before facing my weekend of desperate hope. But I knew rest wouldn't come easily tonight. I turned off the lamp, zoo picture still clutched in my hand, and headed for the stairs. Agnes's room waited at the end of the hall, exactly as she'd left it 5 years ago. Sometimes I stood in her doorway and tried to remember what it felt like when she lived here, when coming home meant coming to me. 3 hours to prove I still mattered. 3 hours to compete with a lifetime of steady erosion. I climbed the stairs slowly, my knees protesting the late hour. Tomorrow I'd shop for ingredients, clean the house until it sparkled, prepare for my daughter's brief return to the life she'd outgrown. But tonight I just held her picture and wondered if love was enough when everything else had failed. The next afternoon found me elbow deep in my back garden, attacking the weeds with more vigor than they deserved. I'd spent the morning replaying Thursday's phone call, analyzing every word for hidden meaning. 3 hours, she'd said it like she was doing me a favor, rationing her time like precious medicine. But at least she was coming. At least I'd have that. The sound of a car door slamming made me freeze mid-pull on a stubborn dandelion. I wasn't expecting anyone. Deliveries came to the front. Through the gap in my fence, I caught a glimpse of silver metallic paint. Agnes's Audi. My heart hammered as I dropped my trowel and wiped dirt from my palms with the rag hanging from my pocket. She never came early. She never came unannounced. I rounded the house to find her striding up my front walk, portfolio case in hand, wearing the kind of sharp blazer that meant business. Her heels clicked against my cracked concrete with military precision. "Dad!" She paused at my front step, taking in my grass-stained knees and soil-caked fingernails. "We need to talk seriously." "Of course, sweetheart." I fumbled with my house key, suddenly aware of how shabby my front door looked next to her polished appearance. "Come in, please." She settled on my living room couch and opened her portfolio with practiced efficiency. Charts and graphs spilled across my coffee table like battle plans. Her eyes sparked with an excitement I hadn't seen in years. "I've been developing something incredible, Dad. A digital marketing consultancy for small businesses." She pointed to a colorful pie chart. "The market is completely underserved. Mom and pop shops, local services, family restaurants, they're all struggling with online presence." I leaned forward, genuinely interested despite my confusion about this surprise visit. "That sounds promising. You always had a gift for seeing opportunities." "Exactly. I've already got 3 potential clients lined up, just from preliminary conversations." She flipped to another page showing revenue projections. "Conservative estimates put me at 6 figures within 18 months. The numbers swam before my eyes. Monthly recurring revenue, client acquisition costs, profit margins, the language of success in a world that had moved beyond my engineering background. "This is impressive, Agnes. Really impressive." I traced the upward trending line with my finger. "But what does this have to do with—" "I need $100,000 for my startup." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my coffee cup tremble in my hand, liquid sloshing against the rim. 100. I set the cup down carefully, buying myself time to process. That's a significant investment." She was already nodding, pulling out more documents. "Office lease for 2 years, professional equipment, initial marketing budget, legal fees for incorporation. It's all calculated down to the penny." My mouth moved without sound for several seconds. The number seemed to grow larger in the silence, expanding until it filled my entire living room. "Dad, I know it sounds like a lot, but this opportunity won't wait." She leaned forward, her voice taking on an urgency that made my chest tight. "There's another firm sniffing around the same market segment. If I don't move now, someone else will capture these clients." Have you approached banks? Business loans?" I heard myself asking practical questions while my mind reeled. "Banks want established revenue history. Collateral I don't have. You know how conservative they are with startups." She waved dismissively. "But family investment is different. It's believing in potential rather than just spreadsheets." Family investment? As if I had the resources of the Rockefellers instead of a pensioned engineer's savings account. "I've run every scenario, Dad. Break even by month 14, full profitability by month 20. These aren't fantasy numbers. They're based on real market research." She continued talking, her voice gaining momentum as she outlined client acquisition strategies and competitive advantages. I nodded at appropriate intervals, made encouraging sounds, but inside I was calculating with desperate precision. $100,000. My entire savings would cover $25,000. Even if I liquidated everything, sold possessions, maybe scraped together $40,000. "So what do you think?" She sat back, eyes bright with anticipation. I looked at her animated face, at the careful preparation spread across my table, at this daughter who still trusted me enough to ask for help. The weight of her expectations pressed against my ribs. I'll try to figure something out, sweetheart. Her smile could have powered my entire house. I knew you'd come through. You always do. She began gathering her materials with efficient movements. I'll need to know by Sunday, though. Monday at the latest. The office space won't stay available long. Sunday. Father's Day. The irony wasn't lost on me. I understand. Time-sensitive opportunities require quick decisions. I helped her stack the papers, my hands moving automatically while my brain scrambled for solutions that didn't exist. She stood, smoothing her blazer. Thanks, Dad. This means everything to me. Finally, I can prove what I'm capable of. I walked her to the door, watching her confident stride back to her car. She turned at the driver's door and waved, her face radiant with certainty that I'd make this impossible thing happen. The Audi disappeared around the corner, leaving me standing in my doorway with her business plan clutched in my dirt-stained hands. The afternoon sun felt too bright, the suburban silence too complete. $100,000. I'd promised my daughter the moon when I could barely afford candles. The business plan felt heavier with each step toward my home office. I closed the front door and walked directly down the hallway, past family photos that seemed to mock me with their frozen moments of financial security. My office was really just the smallest bedroom, converted after the divorce when I couldn't afford to keep the larger house. The wooden desk creaked as I settled into my chair, spreading Agnes's documents beside my outdated computer. While it booted up with mechanical wheezing, I pulled out my reading glasses and opened the filing cabinet labeled Banking. 25,000. That's everything I have. The number had been running through my head since Agnes left, but seeing it confirmed in black and white made my stomach clench. 5 years of disciplined savings since the divorce. Every small sacrifice, every skipped restaurant meal, every postponed purchase had contributed to this modest pile of security. My primary checking account showed $3,647, monthly expenses money, carefully budgeted to last until the next pension deposit. The savings account held $18,650, my pride and shield against emergencies. In the small safe behind my desk, I kept $1,300 in cash for situations when banks weren't accessible. Total liquid assets, $24,197. Rounded up, $25,000. $75,000 short. I pulled up my retirement account next, watching the browser slowly load. $127,000 stared back at me from the screen, but it might as well have been on the moon. Early withdrawal penalties would consume nearly half, and I'd still need to explain the hardship to the IRS. My calculator, worn smooth from years of engineering calculations, clicked under my fingers as I ran numbers that refused to improve. Home equity, maybe $85,000, but selling would take months and leave me homeless. My Honda was worth perhaps $8,000 in trade. The furniture Lula had left behind might bring a few thousand at estate sales. Even liquidating everything I owned, I couldn't reach Agnes's target. I opened each account methodically, double-checking balances I already knew by heart. The slow internet connection made every page load feel like Judgment Day approaching in increments. Each number confirmed what my gut had known from the moment Agnes said those 3 words. 100,000 was beyond my reach. The afternoon light slanted through my small office window, illuminating dust motes that danced above stacks of financial statements. I'd been proud of these modest accounts once. After losing everything in the divorce, building back to $25,000 had felt like a victory. Now it felt like failure. I remembered opening the savings account at this same bank 5 years ago, the teller congratulating me on starting fresh. Each deposit had been deliberate. $200 here, $500 there, birthday money from distant relatives, the occasional overtime from consulting work. Watching that balance climb from zero had restored some dignity to my shrinking world. Agnes used to be impressed by smaller gestures, $5,000 for her first car down payment, $3,000 when she needed help with security deposits. Even $1,000 had seemed generous then, worthy of gratitude and long phone calls about her appreciation, but that was before Eldon entered the picture, before she'd seen what real money could accomplish. I picked up the landline and stared at the keypad, unsure who to call first. My contact list had shrunk along with everything else after the divorce. Old colleagues, scattered by layoffs and relocations, neighbors I barely knew, family members who had their own financial struggles. The safe behind me held more than cash. It contained the title to my house, my insurance policies, my father's will, documents that proved ownership of everything I'd managed to preserve. But even combined, they couldn't bridge the gap between my daughter's dreams and my reality. My coffee from this morning sat cold beside the keyboard, a brown ring staining the wood where the mug had sweated. The wall clock ticked steadily toward 5 o'clock, each second carrying me closer to Sunday's deadline. I pushed back from the desk and rubbed my eyes beneath my glasses. The numbers on the screen blurred together, but the math remained brutally clear. 25,000 available immediately. Maybe another 10 or 15 if I sold everything and took penalties. Still impossible. But I'd promised Agnes I'd figure something out. She'd driven away confident in my ability to make miracles happen, the way fathers were supposed to do, the way I'd always managed before when the problems were smaller and the solutions within reach. I picked up my pen and wrote the numbers on a legal pad, as if seeing them in my own handwriting might reveal some option I'd missed. $100,000 needed, $25,000 available, $75,000 gap. The gap looked even wider on paper. Saturday morning found me at my kitchen table with coffee, a contact list, and diminishing hope. I'd spent Friday evening writing down every person who might possibly help. Sleep had been elusive, and I'd risen before dawn to prepare for what felt like the most important day of my life. The coffee was too strong, my nerves too raw, but I needed the caffeine to face what lay ahead. By 9 o'clock, I was walking into First National Bank, documents tucked under my arm like shields against inevitable rejection. The loan officer, a woman young enough to be Agnes's sister, examined my paperwork with professional courtesy that couldn't hide her skepticism. Unfortunately, Mr. Cruz, your credit rating is adequate, but not exceptional. She slid my credit report across her desk, and without steady employment income, unsecured loans of this magnitude are extremely difficult to approve. I'd known this was likely, but hearing it confirmed felt like a punch to the chest. What about a home equity line of credit? That's possible, but the application process typically takes 4 to 6 weeks. Even expedited processing requires 3 weeks minimum. She consulted her computer screen. Plus, we'd need a current home appraisal, income verification, and debt-to-income calculations. 3 weeks. Agnes needed an answer by Sunday. By 11, I was driving across town to meet Jerry, my former colleague from the engineering firm. We'd worked together for 15 years before the downsizing scattered us like leaves. The coffee shop he'd suggested was nearly empty, fluorescent lights buzzing over vinyl booths that had seen better decades. Winfred, I'd help if I could, but things are tight everywhere. Jerry stirred his coffee nervously, avoiding eye contact. Sarah's medical bills from last year wiped out most of our savings. I might be able to manage 2,000, maybe 3 if I push it. 2,000. I thanked him and meant it, but the number felt like trying to fill the ocean with a teaspoon. The drive to Mike's house took 40 minutes through suburban streets that all looked like my own, modest homes occupied by people making modest livings. Mike had been my college roommate, the best man at my wedding to Lula. If anyone would understand, it would be him. His living room was comfortable but not lavish, family photos showing grandchildren I'd never met. We'd lost touch after the divorce, the way friendships sometimes do when life reshuffles the deck. 5,000, he said after I'd explained Agnes's situation. That's what I can realistically manage, but I'd need 2 weeks to liquidate some investments without taking a major hit. 2 weeks. Another impossible timeline in a day full of them. I wish I could do more, Winfred. That's a hell of a lot of money to raise quickly. He walked me to his car, shaking his head. Have you considered that maybe she should start smaller? Work her way up to something that ambitious? But Agnes wasn't thinking small. She was thinking like Eldon had taught her. Big dreams, aggressive timelines, success measured in 6 figures, rather than careful increments. The antique shop sat on a corner I'd driven past thousands of times without really seeing. Inside, the air smelled of dust and other people's abandoned treasures. The owner, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, examined Lula's jewelry box with professional detachment. The pearls are cultured, not natural, maybe 400. He set them aside and picked up my father's watch collection. These Timexes from the 70s might bring 600 if the mechanisms still work. I'd hoped for thousands. He was offering hundreds. The wedding china set brought the most interest, nearly 2,000 if sold as a complete service for 12. But holding those plates, I could see Lula arranging them for our first Thanksgiving as married couples. Some prices were too high to pay. Total everything here. Maybe 5,000 if you're patient and wait for the right buyers. He gestured around his crowded shop. But if you need quick cash, immediate sale value would be closer to 3. I drove home in early evening light, adding and re-adding numbers that refused to improve. Jerry's possible 2,000. Mike's 5,000 in 2 weeks. Antique sales of maybe 5,000 more. Even the maximum scenarios left me $40,000 short. My driveway had never looked so much like a dead end. I sat in my car for several minutes, calculator in hand, running the numbers one final time. Personal savings, $25,000. Possible loans from friends, $7,000. Antique sales potential, $5,000. Maximum possible total, $37,000. Still $63,000 short. The mathematical reality was inescapable. I could liquidate everything I owned, call in every favor, sell every possession, and still fall dramatically short of Agnes's needs. My house looked smaller as I walked slowly toward the front door, weighted down by the knowledge that tomorrow I'd have to disappoint the person who mattered most to me. The business plan waited on my coffee table where I'd left it, full of charts and projections that assumed her father could work miracles. But miracles, it turned out, required resources I'd never possessed. The sleepless night had been filled with rehearsing how to tell Agnes the truth about the money. I'd prepared a simple Father's Day lunch, hoping against hope she'd understand when I explained my limitations. The turkey was carved, the table set for 2 with my best china, everything arranged to soften the blow of my financial failure. When the doorbell rang at exactly noon, I wiped my hands on the kitchen towel and walked toward the front door with a forced smile. At least I'd have 3 hours to explain everything properly. I opened the door, expecting my daughter. 3 figures stood on my doorstep. My hand gripped the doorframe as reality shifted beneath my feet. Agnes beamed at me from the center, but flanking her like bookends were Lula and Eldon. My ex-wife looked uncomfortable, avoiding direct eye contact. The man who'd replaced me in every way that mattered stood surveying my property with undisguised interest. "Surprise, Dad! I brought Mom and Eldon." The words hit me like cold water. I stumbled backward a step, my carefully planned day dissolving into nightmare. "Hi, Winfred." Lula's voice carried forced cheerfulness. "I hope you don't mind." Eldon stepped forward without invitation, his gaze sweeping across my modest front hallway. "Interesting little place. Very cozy. Cozy. The way you'd describe a child's playhouse or a quaint bed and breakfast. Not a grown man's home." "Of course not," I heard myself saying, muscle memory of politeness overriding shock. "Please come in." They filed past me into my living room, and suddenly the space I'd thought adequate felt cramped. Eldon moved with the confidence of ownership, touching the spine of a book, adjusting a picture frame, settling into my usual armchair as if he belonged there. Agnes twirled in the center of the room, arms spread wide. "Isn't this perfect? All my family together for Father's Day?" All her family. The phrase cut deeper than intended. Lula perched on the edge of the sofa, her purse clutched in her lap like armor. "Your father's made this place very nice, Agnes. Very comfortable." Another diminishing adjective. Comfortable furniture was what you settled for when you couldn't afford beautiful. "I thought this would be good for everyone," Agnes continued, oblivious to the tension crackling through the room. "You know, family bonding, getting to know each other better." Getting to know each other, as if Eldon and I were strangers rather than competitors for her affection. I rushed to the kitchen, calculating frantically. The turkey might stretch to feed 4 if I carved it thin. There were enough vegetables, barely. I pulled additional plates from the cabinet with shaking hands. My carefully planned, intimate meal transformed into an improvised dinner party. "Need any help in there?" Agnes called out. No, everything's under control." The lie came easily, though nothing was under control. My day, my conversation, my dignity, all hijacked by this surprise invasion. Through the kitchen doorway, I watched Eldon examine my bookshelf, pulling out volumes and reading the spines with the thoroughness of an appraiser. He'd moved my favorite lamp to a different table, claiming the prime spot near the window. Lula was making small talk about the neighborhood, her voice artificially bright. Have they finished that construction on Maple Street? It was such a mess when I drove through. When she drove through. Past tense. This wasn't her neighborhood anymore. I carried drinks into the living room on a tray that rattled slightly in my hands. Eldon had made himself completely at home, feet propped on my coffee table, television remote in his hand, though he hadn't turned it on. This turkey smells wonderful, Lula said, accepting her glass with careful fingers that avoided touching mine. Agnes bounced between her mother and Eldon like a translator at a diplomatic summit, ensuring everyone was comfortable, everyone was happy, everyone except the actual host. The dining room's just through here, I announced, gesturing toward the doorway. Everything should be ready. As they filed past me, Agnes grabbed my arm and squeezed. Thank you for being so gracious about this, Dad. I know surprises aren't really your thing, but I thought it would be wonderful to have everyone together. Wonderful for whom? I wanted to ask, but her face glowed with such satisfaction that I could only nod and follow my uninvited guests toward what had become the most important meal of my life. The dining room I'd set so carefully for two now looked pathetically inadequate for four. I hurried to add place settings while they arranged themselves around my small table, the space suddenly feeling more like an interrogation room than a family gathering. Eldon claimed the head of the table, my usual spot, without asking. Agnes sat beside him, naturally gravitating toward his orbit. Lula took the chair opposite, leaving me the remaining seat at what had become the foot of my own table. The hierarchy was established before we'd even said grace. Not that we would. I'd learned years ago not to suggest anything that might make my ex-wife's new husband uncomfortable. The moment we stepped onto the back patio, I turned to face her. Inside, Lula's voice drifted through the open kitchen window, making polite observations about my flower beds. Eldon's deeper tones rumbled in response, already claiming expertise about landscaping choices I'd made alone. Why did you bring them here, Agnes? She crossed her arms defensively, that familiar gesture from her teenage years when caught in something she couldn't quite justify. Eldon wanted to see your house. Mom did too. This was supposed to be our day, our time together. I kept my voice low, aware that sound carried easily between my small rooms. 3 hours, remember? That's all you could spare. I thought this would be better. Her chin lifted with practiced defiance. More meaningful, like a real family gathering instead of just obligation. Obligation. The word hung between us like smoke. I walked deeper into the garden, away from the windows where our audience might overhear. Agnes followed, her heels clicking against the stone path I'd laid myself 5 years ago. You planned this? It wasn't a question. The surprise, bringing them both. This wasn't spontaneous. She fidgeted with her earring, a tell that remained from childhood. Eldon thought it would be good for everyone to spend time together. You know, blended family bonding. Blended family. Another phrase that erased my singular importance in her life. What did you tell them about our conversation yesterday? I pressed. About your business plans? Nothing yet. She glanced toward the house, checking that we weren't being observed. I wanted today to go well first. You know how Mom gets about business talk. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by fresh dread. If she hadn't mentioned the money yet, that conversation was still coming, with an audience. Agnes, about what we discussed yesterday. We can talk about that later, Dad. Right now, I just want everyone to get along. She checked her watch. An expensive piece I didn't recognize. Besides, there's plenty of time to work out the details. Work out the details. As if my financial impossibility were merely a scheduling conflict. A burst of laughter came from inside, Eldon's voice, rich with amusement at some observation I couldn't hear. Agnes smiled reflexively at the sound. He's really trying, you know, she said. This isn't easy for him either, coming to to your house. His what? Wife's ex-husband's house? Territory he'd already conquered? The pause revealed more than any completed sentence could have. I appreciate the effort, I lied. But next time, perhaps a little warning would be. There won't be a next time if today goes badly. Her tone shifted, becoming sharper. I'm trying to build something here, Dad. Something that works for everyone. But that requires flexibility from all parties. All parties. I was a party to negotiations in my own life. I thought you'd be happy, she continued, warming to her theme. Having your whole family here for Father's Day. Isn't that what fathers want? Their children surrounded by people who love them? People who love them. The category apparently now included Eldon. Through the window, I could see him examining my kitchen cabinets, opening doors to check the contents. Lula hovered nearby, torn between stopping him and avoiding conflict. He was mapping my domestic territory with the thoroughness of a general planning occupation. Your phone's buzzing, Agnes said, nodding toward my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting some robocall or neighborhood notification. Instead, I found 3 missed calls from Jerry, the colleague who'd offered to help with loans. My heart hammered as I realized what this might mean. I should take this, I mumbled, but Agnes was already walking back toward the house. Don't be long, she called over her shoulder. Lunch is getting cold, and Eldon hates cold food. Eldon hates cold food. In my house, my preferences had become secondary to those of a man who'd invited himself to my table. I followed her toward the back door, phone heavy in my pocket. Whatever Jerry had to say would have to wait. Right now, I had to return to my own dining room and play gracious host to the people who were systematically dismantling my relationship with my daughter. But as we approached the house, Agnes turned back one more time. I really hope this works out, Dad, for everyone's sake. The warning in her voice was unmistakable. Sometimes you have to adapt to new family dynamics. That's just how life evolves. Life evolves. My role had evolved from father to supporting cast member in my daughter's expanding family drama. The voices inside grew louder as we reached the door. Eldon was holding court about something, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. Lula laughed at appropriate intervals, playing her part in this performance. I was about to rejoin them and discover exactly how far my evolution had progressed. Agnes pushed through the back door with cheerful energy. Lunch is ready, everyone! I followed her inside, noting how naturally she'd assumed the role of co-host in my own home. Eldon rose from where he'd been examining my spice rack, while Lula carefully returned a photograph to the counter, a picture of Agnes's graduation she'd been studying with unreadable expression. The dining room felt smaller, with 4 people crowding around my modest table. I'd hastily added the extra place settings, but the mismatched chairs and cramped quarters advertised my bachelor inadequacy. Eldon settled into the head chair, my chair, with the casual assumption of someone accustomed to taking the best seat. Agnes slid in beside him, leaving Lula across from her, and me relegated to the foot of my own table. This looks delicious, Winfred, Lula offered, her voice carrying forced brightness. You always did know your way around a turkey. Turkey's a bit dry, but not bad for home cooking. Eldon's fork dissected the meat with surgical precision. Most people overcook it. Easy mistake to make without proper equipment. I managed fine, got used to it over 5 years. The words came out more defensive than intended. Agnes shot me a warning look while cutting her portion into precise pieces. Curious how you manage such a big house alone, Eldon continued, his gaze sweeping the dining room with appraiser's eyes. Must be quite the challenge, maintenance-wise. The house isn't that big, I replied carefully, spooning cranberry sauce with hands that wanted to shake. Just right for one person. Still, all those rooms to heat in winter, property taxes on a place this size. He gestured vaguely at my crown molding, probably calculating square footage. Economic efficiency would suggest something more compact. Agnes laughed, the sound sharp in the confined space. Eldon's always thinking about optimization. It's what makes him so successful in business. Successful in business, unlike her father, apparently. Lula attempted rescue with desperate cheerfulness. The neighborhood's really maintained its character, though. Those oak trees must be 60 years old. Mature landscaping definitely adds value, Eldon agreed, though I noticed the gutters could use attention, and that front step has quite a crack developing. Every observation was a small blade, precisely placed. My house wasn't just a home, It was evidence of decline, of a man unable to properly maintain what he owned. I focused on carving more turkey, the knife feeling heavier with each slice. The meal I'd prepared with such care was being consumed by people inventorying my failures. "Dad always makes the best holiday meals," Agnes said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Remember that Christmas stuffing, Mom, with the chestnuts?" "That was wonderful," Lula agreed quickly. "You always put so much thought into the details." "Details matter," Eldon observed, reaching across me without asking to access the salt. "Though sometimes it's more efficient to delegate. Professional catering, for instance, saves time for more important things." More important things than a father cooking for his daughter? The implication hung in the air like the scent of overcrowded flowers. Agnes checked her phone, then looked around the table with satisfaction. "This is exactly what I hoped for. All my parents together, sharing a meal." All her parents. The phrase completed my demotion from father to member of a committee. "Wine would complement this nicely," Eldon noted, examining his water glass with mild disapproval. "Perhaps a nice Pinot Noir. I've got an excellent bottle we brought back from Sonoma." We. Their shared experiences, their coupled pronouns, their joint ownership of superior taste and travel opportunities. "I'm not much of a wine drinker," I admitted, though I'd enjoyed wine plenty during my marriage. Financial constraints had simply moved it from necessity to luxury. Shame. Good wine education opens so many doors. Eldon's smile contained no warmth. Business dinners, client entertainment, social connections, really essential in today's market. Today's market, where I no longer competed, where men like me were relics of an earlier, less sophisticated era. The conversation continued around me, through me, occasionally including me like a courtesy extended to an elderly relative. Agnes grew more animated, discussing her work, her plans, her bright future supported by people who understood today's market. When dessert was suggested, coffee and the store-bought pie I'd hidden in my freezer, I realized this performance was far from over. The phone in my pocket buzzed again. Jerry's third call, probably urgent given his persistence. But I couldn't escape now, couldn't abandon my post while Eldon continued his systematic catalog of my domestic and financial shortcomings. "Coffee sounds perfect," Agnes declared, rising to clear plates with efficient movements. "Dad, you sit. Mom and I will handle cleanup." Even the cleanup was being managed by others in my own home. I remained in my exile at the foot of the table while Eldon leaned back in my chair, surveying his conquered territory with visible satisfaction. Soon, very soon, Agnes would remember the money conversation we hadn't finished. And when that moment came, I'd have to confess my failure in front of the man who'd already replaced me in every other way that mattered. Coffee cups sat empty around the table as Agnes checked her watch with visible satisfaction. "We should stay a bit longer," she announced, settling back into her chair beside Eldon. "Make this a real family afternoon." The meaningful glance she exchanged with him sent ice through my veins. This wasn't spontaneous hospitality. It was orchestrated timing for something I couldn't yet see coming. Eldon reached into his jacket pocket with theatrical precision, his fingers closing around something that made him smile. The gesture had the weight of ceremony, like a magician preparing his finale. "Actually, Agnes, before we get too comfortable—" He withdrew a folded check with flourish, worthy of a game show host. "I have something for you." The paper made a crisp sound as he placed it on my table, right beside the coffee stain that was slowly spreading across the wood. Even upside down, I could see the amount clearly written in his confident handwriting. $100,000. "Agnes, here's a check for $100,000 for your startup." Her gasp was genuine, hands flying to cover her mouth in surprise. She hadn't known. Whatever game was being played here, she hadn't coordinated this move with him. "Eldon, I can't believe—" She leapt from her chair and threw her arms around his neck, pressing her face against his shoulder. "Thank you, Dad. You're such a real father." A real father. The words hit harder than any physical blow could have. I stared at the check, my modest savings account balance flashing through my mind like a neon sign advertising inadequacy. 25,000. That's what I'd scraped together through 5 years of careful budgeting and sacrifice. "I have 25,000 in savings." The words escaped before I could stop them, pathetic, and desperate in the sudden silence. Agnes spun toward me, her face transforming from joy to something I'd never seen before. Pure contempt mixed with years of accumulated disappointment, all focused on my trembling voice. 25,000, she laughed, but the sound contained no humor. That's it? That's what 33 years of fatherhood gets me? I tried to explain about the banks, the friends I'd contacted, the antiques I'd priced, but she was already moving toward me with frightening intensity. You never loved me. The accusation exploded from her like a physical force. All these years, I thought you cared, but you can't even manage what Eldon does without thinking twice. Agnes, sweetheart, that's not. Eldon is my real father. He proves it every day while you sit in this sad little house counting pennies. The slap came so fast I barely saw her hand move. The sharp crack echoed through my small dining room like a gunshot, followed by the immediate sting across my cheek and the metallic taste of blood where my tooth cut my lip. The silence that followed was complete. Even the old house seemed to hold its breath. Lula gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in horror. Eldon sat frozen in his chair, apparently shocked that his demonstration of superiority had triggered violence. Agnes stood over me, her chest heaving with righteous anger, her palms still tingling from impact. I remained seated, my head turned from the blow, feeling the heat spread across my cheek. The coffee cup had overturned when I flinched, adding brown liquid to the growing stain on my tablecloth. Such a small detail to notice in a moment that changed everything. Slowly, carefully, I reached for my napkin and dabbed at the blood on my lip. The white fabric came away stained red, evidence of my daughter's final rejection. 33 years of bedtime stories, scraped knee bandages, proud moments at school plays and graduations, all dismissed with one violent gesture. But as I sat there tasting blood and feeling the burn across my face, something shifted inside me. The blow had been meant to finish me, to demonstrate my complete irrelevance in her life. Instead, it had freed me from the last constraint holding back my final weapon. I stood slowly, my full height restored despite the physical assault. Agnes remained defiant before me, still convinced she held all the power. Eldon watched from his stolen position at my table, his satisfaction tempered by discomfort at the violence he'd instigated. Lula stared at her daughter with dawning horror, as if seeing a stranger wearing Agnes's face. The check lay forgotten on my table, its zeros meaningless now, because I held something worth far more than money, the truth that would change everything Agnes thought she knew about love, family, and what it meant to be a real father. I wiped the blood from my lip with deliberate precision, each movement calculated to reclaim the dignity stolen by that slap. The dining room held its breath. Agnes stood before me in triumphant rage, certain she'd delivered the killing blow to our relationship. Eldon remained seated in my chair, his earlier confidence flickering as the violence registered. Lula watched her daughter with growing horror, finally seeing the cruelty beneath the polished exterior. I straightened to my full height and looked directly at Agnes, my voice steady despite the metallic taste in my mouth. You're right, Agnes. I'm not your real father. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Agnes's defiant expression wavered, confusion replacing righteous anger. What? What do you mean? I let the silence stretch, watching understanding begin to dawn in her eyes. 33 years of deception were about to crumble in the space of a few sentences. We took you from the orphanage when you were 2 years old. Her face went white. The hand that had struck me moments before now trembled against her chest. That's not possible. Her voice cracked on each word. You're lying. Mom, tell him he's lying. Lula's tears had already begun, streaming down her cheeks as she shook her head slowly. It's true, sweetheart. We wanted to tell you, but the years kept passing and it never seemed like the right time. Agnes's legs gave way. She groped blindly for her chair, missing it entirely and stumbling backward until she hit the wall. The sound of her body against the plaster echoed through the room. 2 years old? She whispered. I've been all this time. Your birth parents couldn't care for you, I continued, my engineer's precision serving me well in this moment of ultimate revelation. Social services placed you with us for adoption. We loved you from the first moment we saw you. Scared, tiny, clinging to a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. Eldon's smug expression had completely evaporated. He sat motionless in my chair, finally understanding he'd inserted himself into a family dynamic far more complex than he'd imagined. For 33 years, I've been your father by choice, not biology. My voice grew stronger with each word. Every night I checked on you when you had nightmares about the place before us. Every scraped knee I bandaged. Every school play I attended. Every moment of pride in your accomplishments. None of it was required by blood. Agnes slid down the wall until she was sitting on my dining room floor, her expensive clothing wrinkled and her carefully styled hair disheveled. You chose me. Every single day. I knelt beside her, ignoring the ache in my knees. When you were 5 and afraid of monsters under the bed. When you were 16 and thought the world was ending because Tommy Morrison didn't notice you. When you graduated college and called me crying with joy. Every day I chose to be your father. She looked up at me through tears that had replaced her earlier fury. But Eldon, he gave me the money. Money. I gestured toward the forgotten check on my table. He gave you money. I gave you a life, a name, a family, an identity. I gave you 33 years of loving a child who wasn't mine by any definition except the ones that matter. Lula moved closer, her own tears falling freely. We thought about telling you so many times, especially after the divorce, but you were already struggling with the family changes, and we didn't want to add another trauma. Eldon finally found his voice, though it lacked its earlier authority. I didn't know. Agnes never mentioned. Because she didn't know, I said simply. No one outside this family knew except the lawyers and social workers, and they're bound by confidentiality. As far as the world was concerned, Agnes was our biological daughter. Agnes reached up with shaking fingers to touch the red mark her slap had left on my cheek. You let me hit you. You let me call you a failure. Say you weren't my real father. Because I wanted you to understand the difference between real fatherhood and biological accident. I caught her hand gently. Eldon became your mother's husband and gained you as part of the package. I chose you before I ever met you, sight unseen, just because you needed a family. The check rustled in the air conditioning, a sound that seemed absurdly loud in our small circle of revelation. All of Eldon's money, all his displays of material superiority, meant nothing in the face of 3 decades of chosen love. Agnes stared at me with new eyes, seeing perhaps for the first time the man who had fought to adopt her, who had loved her without obligation, who had sacrificed and saved and worried and celebrated every milestone of a life he'd chosen to nurture. I struck the man who saved me from an orphanage, she whispered, the full weight of her actions finally settling on her shoulders. Agnes remained on my dining room floor for several minutes, her sobs the only sound breaking the heavy silence. I stayed kneeling beside her while she processed 33 years of her life through this new lens. Lula hovered nearby, maternal instincts warring with uncertainty about how to comfort a daughter whose world had just shattered. Even Eldon sat quietly, his earlier dominance completely deflated. Finally, Agnes lifted her tear-streaked face to mine. All those years. You never told me I wasn't your blood, but you loved me anyway. You were never not my blood, I corrected gently. You became my blood the moment I signed those adoption papers. Biology is just the starting point. Love is what makes family. She struggled to her knees, then reached up to touch the mark her hand had left on my cheek with trembling fingers. Oh my, what have I done? Forgive me, Dad. The word Dad sounded different now, weighted with new understanding rather than casual dismissal. You loved me without knowing I wasn't your blood, she continued, her voice breaking with each word. You chose me when my real parents couldn't. You saved me from whatever would have happened if I'd stayed in that system. I helped her to her feet, my old knees protesting, but my heart lighter than it had been in years. You've always been my daughter, Agnes. Always. She threw her arms around me with desperate intensity, the embrace of someone who had nearly lost everything precious and only just realized its value. I'm so sorry. I compared you to him like money was love. like providing was the same as caring. Over her shoulder, I could see Eldon sitting motionless in my chair, the check still visible on my table but forgotten by everyone in the room. All his wealth, all his displays of superiority, couldn't compete with the bond forged through 3 decades of chosen devotion. "Can you forgive me?" Agnes whispered against my shoulder. "For hitting you? For saying such terrible things? For not seeing what you really gave me?" "There's nothing to forgive," I murmured, smoothing her hair the way I had when she was small and frightened. "You're my daughter. That means loving you even when you forget who we are to each other." Lula moved closer, her own tears finally slowing. "We should have told you years ago. We were afraid it would change how you saw us, how you saw yourself." Agnes pulled back to look between us. "It does change things. It makes everything bigger, more meaningful. You didn't have to love me, but you chose to anyway." She turned toward Eldon, who was studying the tablecloth with uncomfortable intensity. "I'm sorry for putting you in this position. I asked both of you for money without understanding what I was really asking." He nodded stiffly, clearly out of his depth in this emotional territory. "The check is still yours if you want it, for the business." Agnes looked at the paper on my table, then back at me. "I don't think I need it any more. Not like that." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Maybe I need to start smaller, build something myself instead of looking for shortcuts." I felt pride swell in my chest, not the desperate pride of a man proving his worth, but the quiet satisfaction of watching someone you love make a wise choice. "Your father would be proud of that decision," Lula said softly, and for the first time in 5 years, she was clearly referring to me. The afternoon light had shifted through my windows, casting new shadows across the dining room where so much had been broken and rebuilt. The coffee stain on my tablecloth would be permanent, I realized, but it would serve as a reminder of the day we found our way back to each other. Agnes stepped back from our embrace but kept her hand in mine. "I know this doesn't fix everything immediately. I have 33 years of taking your love for granted to make up for." "We have time," I said simply. "That's what family gives you. Time to get it wrong and try again." Eldon cleared his throat awkwardly. "Perhaps we should head home, give you two some space to talk." Agnes nodded, then surprised me by turning to him with genuine kindness. "Thank you for wanting to help with the business, and for showing me what I was really looking for in a father. I already had it." As they prepared to leave, Agnes hugged me once more, longer this time and without the desperate edge of earlier. "Happy Father's Day, Dad," she whispered. "My real father." The house felt different after they left, not empty but peaceful. I cleaned up the coffee stain and put away the dishes, moving slowly and savoring the quiet. The check remained on my table, where Eldon had left it, but somehow it seemed smaller now, less significant. Tomorrow Agnes would call, and we would begin the work of rebuilding what we'd nearly lost. But tonight I would sit in my chair, and remember the weight of my daughter's arms around me and the sound of her calling me Dad, with new understanding of what the word really meant. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.